Why don't we start out on Future Made in Australia? Michelle, a little light on for detail, but we might talk about sort of the rationale behind this program outlined by the Prime Minister today. Globalisation isn't exactly dead. It was put under some strain, I suppose, in the pandemic. Its weakest links were. Why does Australia need to enter and try to win a race it has little or no record of sustained commercial success in? Things like production of solar panels, for instance.
Hi Greg, hi Zoe. We need to revitalise our industrial base in this country. After a wasted decade under the Liberals, we fell to the bottom of the league table when it came to sovereign manufacturing capability in the OECD. In fact, we were the bottom of that table. And we want to turn that around. The United States, for example, has the Inflation Reduction Act, and we are now going to have a Future Made in Australia Act. An act that will enable us to compete on the world stage and to really leverage our strengths. We have, for example, a commitment to green hydrogen, a commitment to gigascale solar and wind manufacturing and rollout in this country. And Australia as a country could in fact lower the world's emissions by 8 to 9%. But for that to happen, it means that we also have to value add to our raw materials. So, for example, a tonne of lithium currently sells for $26,000. We buy that back as an electric vehicle that costs $70,000 to $100,000. We need to actually value add to our raw materials and create jobs. The wealth of Australia till now has been underwritten by fossil fuels and by other commodities. But the next chapter of our economic story will be underwritten by green energy.
All right.
And a Future Made in Australia makes that happen.
All right, so you know a bit in a previous professional life about international investment and the way such markets work. Is it clear to you how much incentive, indeed how many dollars, might be needed to kickstart the sort of things that Michelle's talking about here?
Look, while I also agree that there is merit in sovereign capability in manufacturing, the problem is how the government's going about doing that. This is a big government is back announcement, a Labor left wet dream you might call it, in terms of making sure that everything is in the government's hands. The Prime Minister was quite explicit that this will be the government deciding where investment goes, the government backing certain winners. Do you know what? This government has a ready-made boost for competitiveness, productivity and collaboration and investment sitting on the table in the form of the EU FTA. It was ready to be done late last year, a market of 450 million people, so that we are in fact sharing our critical minerals with like-minded countries and investing in this green future together with a very valuable market indeed. That right. EU deal's been sitting there for a year to be done and still nothing. So whilst sovereign capability in manufacturing is good, let's do it the right way. Let's get investment into Australia, Australian know-how, global know-how coming here to work on developing it rather than the government holding all the strings.
All right. I guess the government would argue on the EU, in fact it did, that it was a raw deal for farmers and so it was parked for that reason. But Michelle, just back to you on the point that Zoe raises there. Is it healthy for government to use the old phrase, picking winners, if it's directing incentives and dollars around to these market operators, investors?
Firstly, we won't be lectured by the Liberals. It was the Liberals who waved away our car industry. It happened under Joe Hockey. And in fact, they goaded that industry and that industry left. So they are in no position to be lecturing us on resuscitating manufacturing and bringing back advanced manufacturing to this country. In terms of government's role, government has to be a constructive contributor to the next chapter of Australia's prosperity. And this is happening in advanced economies right around the world. In fact, the US has a very activist role through the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act. The EU and Japan and Germany and France have all taken very similar approaches. True. So it's about an investment signal. It's about sending an investment signal and attracting international investment to Australia and leveraging off our strengths, our stability, our skilled capability, and of course our natural resources. And this Act will pull those strengths together.
Yeah, all right. Well, I'm not exactly clear on what's going to be in the Act and what it will enable us to do that we're not currently doing. But just on that point, back to you, Zoe. Zoe. The market is rather skewed at the moment by huge offers on the table from US Inflation Reduction Act and the like around Asia and Europe. It's either get in and give it a real crack or not at all, isn't it?
Well, interestingly, our government here, as well as the US, are quite lucky that the World Trade Organisation is in a bit of a schmozzle at the moment, because China's already begun proceedings against the US Act because they say that it's unfair and it denies them the free market that they're meant to have in the United States. So in the good old days, what would happen is we'd create a level playing field and everyone should be able to compete. And Australian products can and do compete. We are the best in the world in many areas. The problem is when you put your finger on the competitive button and give Australian companies a disproportionate advantage, what will happen is they'll get lazy. We know what happens when you put government money into things, you get lethargy. You'd see it in our own local councils. When the council does it, it costs twice as much as when the community does it. If you've got an NDIS cleaner, they get $100 an hour versus one working in my local hotel will get $35 an hour. When the government's money is in there, it changes the incentives, and generally speaking, the person who loses out is the taxpayer.
All right, let's follow that through.
I just want to say something. Michelle. I mean, you know, look at CSL, look at the Commonwealth Bank, look at Telstra. These were once government-owned businesses and backed businesses, and they're now iconic Australian institutions. So that just doesn't make sense.
Okay, let's not get into. You might accidentally trigger a nationalisation argument there, which we won't get into.